In order to create a diverse and ethical workforce, we need to first understand what ethics are, and that's what we're going to talk about this first week. There are a number of definitions of ethics, all focusing on moral principles and guidelines for behavior. Ethics is a science of human choice concerned with the basic guidelines for how one ought to live one's life. It answers the question, how should I live? Farrell, Frederick, and Farrell defined ethics as the study and philosophy of human conduct with an emphasis on determining right and wrong. Ethics is the systematic study of general principles of right and wrong behavior. Are ethics and morals the same? Many people use the terms interchangeably. However, some ethical scholars tell us that they are not always synonymous. Ethics is most commonly described as a reason-based system for moral decision-making. Morals are said to be beliefs about right and wrong and are often based on sociological conditions and are learned behavior that may vary from one culture to another. What seems perfectly natural and morally just in one culture may not be in another. Here we have a list of several philosophical ethical theories. These assume basic principles intended to help individuals make decisions involving right or wrong conduct. Over the next few slides, we're going to address each theory and describe the principles common to each. First, we have our principles of utilitarianism. The action taken is ethical if it produces the most good and the least harm for everyone affected. Judgment is based on a cost-benefit analysis, but keep in mind, some costs and benefits are difficult or impossible to measure. Focus is on the results of the action, not on how the results are achieved. It assumes the end justifies the means. Some things to think about with the principles of utilitarianism. Again, sometimes it is difficult to measure all the good and all the costs. Some things are just immeasurable. Utilitarianism has been criticized as too numeric because measuring costs and benefits omits any human element. And then the utilitarian theory looks at only the result of the actions, not how the actions are accomplished. Even though the results may be good, sometimes unethical methods are used to achieve the results. Next, we have the principle of categorical imperative, sometimes called the principle of rights. An action is ethical because the individual engaging in the action has a moral right to do so. A right is an entitlement intended to protect someone's interests. Now, the golden rule in this principle is you should engage in an action only if you agree everyone else should do it too. What if the actions were reversed? You should be willing to have the action done to you as well. Now, some things to think about in this principle. How do we know what rights people have? We don't all agree on what rights are universal. Americans believe in the right to own property, such as real estate. Well, in many areas of the world, the public is not allowed to own property at all. What happens when one person's rights conflict with another person's rights? How do we determine whose rights to take precedent? Next, let's talk about the principles of ethics of care. The morally correct action is one that is appropriately cares for the individuals involved. A person's moral obligations are not to follow impartial principles, but rather to care for the good of the particular individuals. This theory emphasizes special relationships. Now, some things to think about in this one. Does this ethical theory promote favoritism? It might. If two children are in danger and one of them is yours, you would rescue your child first, and most would say your action was ethical. Is it ever okay to favor some employees over others? What about affirmative action? Next, let's talk about the principles of Aristotle's virtue ethics. In this one, the morally correct action is the one that displays good character virtues. A virtue is a character trait that manifests itself in the actions of the individual. Virtues are traits such as honesty, fairness, integrity, or loyalty. A few things to think about with this principle. Are virtuous persons always ethical? Most of us tend to expect ethical behavior to reflect a person's virtue. However, sometimes virtuous people engage in unethical behaviors. Can we separate a person's character from a person's actions? The last principle we'll talk about today is principles of ethical relativism. Relativism claims there are no universal ethical principles. Each society determines what is morally right and wrong. Because different societies have different moral beliefs, there is no rational way to determine if an action is morally right or wrong. Therefore, it would not make sense to criticize any standards in a society as long as its members conform to the standards. Because moral standards are affected by culture and will be different across cultures, the theory of ethical relativism suggests that there are no absolute ethical principles. Based on cultural morals, ethics and ethical conduct will be whatever a particular society believes it to be. For example, many U.S. businesses frown on nepotism in hiring, fearing that it may lead to favoritism and inequality. However, in many countries, nepotism in staffing is not considered wrong. Obtaining a position based on family relationships is often found in collective cultures. Many ethical scholars reject ethical relativism, believing it may generate unacceptable consequences. Now that we've explored some ethical theories, let's talk a little bit more about the moral development that we mentioned earlier. Jean Piaget was one of the first psychologists to investigate whether we are born as moral beings or if moral integrity develops over time. He proposed a two-stage theory of moral development, asserting that around ages 10 to 11, children undergo a shift in moral thinking, moving away from judgments based on consequences to judgments based on intentions. In the 1960s, Piaget's theory was expanded by the work of psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, who believed that moral development was not as simple as the two-stage process suggested by Piaget. Kohlberg proposed a theory of moral development involving 6 stages. The research done by Piaget and Kohlberg suggests that we are not born with moral character, but that it develops over time. Kohlberg hypothesized that individuals move from infantile emphasis on themselves to fully developed individuals with ethical values and respect for the dignity of others. Let's talk about Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development in a little more detail. Stage 1 is called the obedience and punishment stage. In this stage, the individual sees rules as fixed and absolute. Rules are obeyed to avoid punishment. There's typically no concern with the interests of others, and it doesn't care if actions harm other people. Stage 2 is the individualism and exchange stage. In this stage, individuals are generally egoistic and will act based on what serves their needs best. Reciprocity is possible, but only if the individual gets something out of it for him or herself. We are likely to see these stages of behaviors in small children who tend to be self-oriented with little understanding or regard for the needs of others. Stage 3 is called good boy, good girl orientation. At this stage, there's an emphasis on conformity, with the expectation that the individual will live up to social expectations. This is where we learn from our culture what we are expected to be nice. Stage 4 is far less egoistic than the previous stages. At this stage, the individual begins to consider society as a whole when making judgments. Obeying the rules, respect for others, and doing one's duty are strong values at this stage. Individuals in stage 5 understand differing values and opinions and respect the rights of others even when they may disagree. With the recent recession and lower organizational profits, we have seen some instances of stage 5, or willing to sacrifice, behavior in the CEOs who refused bonuses or who agreed to work for $1 a year until their company regains profitability. Stage 6, principles of justice are internalized and moral reasoning emerges based on the universal principles and abstract reasoning. This is the stage where we find the whistleblower. Stage 6 individuals will follow their own ethical principles, even if they conflict with group norms or rules and laws. Although Kohlberg's ideas have had a significant effect on the way we educate young children, he is not without critics. Some critics argue that because his research subjects were children from Western cultures, his stages may not apply in the same way to individuals from other cultures. Cultural values will differ, and non-Western children may move through stages at different rates. Feminist scholar Carol Gillian notes that Kohlberg's research subjects were exclusively male, and she suggests that female progress through the stages may be different than that identified in Kohlberg's research as well. But regardless of the criticism, Kohlberg gives us much to think about as we attempt to understand how moral judgment develops and how that affects ethical behavior. So what do you think? Is there a link between moral judgment and ethical behavior? Do people always behave in a way that embodies their moral judgment? Unfortunately, research indicates there's a disconnect between moral judgment and ethical behavior. Moral judgment may develop along Kohlberg stages, but ethical action develops independently. Even individuals with high moral standards may at times engage in unethical activities.